Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 436 for the 10th of Shvat in a regular year. We all like to think of ourselves as sane, rational people, and most likely in this day and age, not idolaters, right? Like, how many of you would consider yourself to be an idolater? I'm guessing not that many of you, especially if you're here and you're listening to this podcast about the Tanya, about Judaism, and all of that. But what if I were to tell you that the mere fact of human existence has within it a sort of built-in mechanism that makes us a little bit insane, that gives us the tendency to actually be idol worshippers? What do I mean by this? Well, let's start with the definition of insanity. How would we define insanity? People often say insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Honestly, I don't know where this quote comes from. It doesn't really make much sense to me. I think a much better definition of insanity is doing something and behaving in such a way that goes totally counter to reality, kind of living in this like delusional state. And so once you start learning Chassidus and things like that, you start to really understand reality for what it is. And you start to see the deeper and understand the deeper underpinnings of reality and what reality is all about. And that the way that we sort of are accustomed to see reality and ourselves even is not necessarily the truth at first glance. And sometimes we have to dig a little bit deeper in order to see that true reality. So what do I mean by that? Well, the biggest culprit in this scenario is what we commonly understand to be in kind of modern day vernacular as the ego. In Chassidus, we've talked about this in terms of being the Nefesh Bahamis, but it's a much broader kind of area of this. This is basically what encompasses this level of delusion is pretty much anything that believes or feels itself to be a substantial existence apart from God. Because as we know, as we've been studying so far in the Tanya, the only true reality is God. Everything stems from God. Everything is, sure, God, created this world in such a way that we perceive ourselves to be apart from him. But the true reality from God's perspective is that nothing is really apart from him. God creates the world through speech. And we discussed how the speech of God can be more likened to our inner self, like our pre-verbal state, like the way that our speech is before we actually speak or even think the words into manifestation. That's really how God creates the world. So when we have this in mind, this gives us a much broader definition of idolatry, where no longer is idolatry all about denying God's existence or maybe even worshiping another like God, so to speak, like a deity that maybe like a little statue that you have in your home or something like that. But it's really any time that a person has a consciousness, has a sense that they have an independent existence apart from God, that their life and existence is not totally and 100% dependent upon and attached to God at every single moment, which is why we find that the Gemara in Masechet Sota actually likens arrogance to idolatry. Because when a person is feeling arrogance, this is like the epitome of denying, like saying that you are so great, you are so smart, you are so beautiful, whatever it is. It's like giving yourself the credit for something that actually has absolutely nothing to do with you. It's all coming from God. All of our gifts, all of our achievements, all of our accomplishments are really just manifestations of God. And we are the channels that bring these things about. So I think this is going to get a lot clearer once we get into the text. So let's see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And for context, we're going to be learning the second half of chapter 22 in Likutei Amarim. So the Alter Rebbe begins this section by explaining to us that the source of the vitality of all the worlds is God's supernal will, right? So that makes sense, right? That God wills the world into existence. That's sort of like the origin of the creation of all the worlds. And it's specifically in the aspect of God's will that is the front part of God's will, the panim in Hebrew it's called. And we've mentioned that this word panim is really interesting because on the one hand, it means face. It also alludes to the idea of the front. And it also has a similar etymology to the idea of inside, bifnim. So in Hebrew, those of you that know modern Hebrew, panim, face, lifnim is in front of, and bifnim is inside, are all related etymologically. And so that's the idea. It's sort of like when you're looking at somebody face to face, you're like looking at them in an internal way. You're having this like inner connection to them. And so since this is how God creates the world, is in this like very personable kind of way, like in the face of his supernal world, then what about those things that are against God's will? What about those things that are in the realm of what we call the Sitra Achra, aka the other side, those things that specifically conceal God? So in that case, even though, yes, even these things are coming ultimately from God's will and even coming from God's internal will, his face-to-face will, it's not manifest as such. So in this case, so with those kind of things, the way that the Tanya terms it is, it says that God's will does not dwell on the Sitra Achra in this kind of internal face-to-face manner. And even when it comes to the back side of the supernal will, the achoraim, as we call it in Hebrew, then even in that case, then the backside of God's will, we don't say that it's enclosed within these forces of the Sitra Achra, but rather it just hovers above it from above. So it's like it's kind of like a little one step removed from these things. So it's there for sure, but it's like one step removed. And this is why when we talk about the Sitra Achra, when we talk about this other side, we kind of say that this is the space of death and of impurity. God should save us from these things. So there's sort of this understanding here that when we talk about God and a direct manifestation of God's light and energy, we kind of say that this is synonymous with life versus what is death. Death is the opposite of life. Death is the opposite of this revelation of God, of godliness and God's will in a direct manner. So nevertheless, since everything comes from God, right? So there's nothing that's actually devoid of God. Then these things, these Sitra Achra, this other side, these things that conceal God, they obviously still are receiving their vitality from the holiness above, but they're receiving their vitality in a backhanded manner, in the way of achoraim, and thus because they're receiving and they're suckling their vitality in this backhanded manner, because again, it's like they cannot get any kind of sustenance of their own. They have to get it from God. Everything is sustained by God, but thus because they're getting it in this backhanded manner, then the aspect of godliness that's found within them, because it must be found within them in order to keep them alive, is in an aspect of galus. It's in an aspect of exile. And this is what we term the galus hashchina that we talked about above, the exile of the shchina, of the divine dwelling. And this is why, now we can understand why it is that these klipos, these negative forces, what do we call them? Like another way that we refer to these things is elokim acherim, other gods. So it's this idea of other, and again, this word acherim is really interesting because acherim, which means other, also comes from the same etymology as achoraim, which is backside. So it's the backside is also acher, it's also different. And this is actual avodah zarah. This is actual idolatry, and this is a denial of the unity of God, the unity of the one God. So like this exiled state of the Shekhinah, and of the godliness that's found within these things, it creates this kind of like warped perception that these things, these beings, are not totally nullified to the holiness of God, because it's like they're not experiencing God in this direct way. They're experiencing God in this indirect way. So thus this makes it so that they are not totally nullified to Him, and they can actually they become arrogant. They like the imagery the Alter Rebbe uses is that they're like an eagle who, and he brings a few citations from this, from Yeshayahu and from Zephaniah, and also from Yechezkel. So it's a bunch of different verses that the Alter Rebbe kind of compiles into one, where it says, Ani v'afsi od, there's nothing beside me, or Ye'or li v'ani sitani, the river is mine and I have made myself. So there's this idea like Pharaoh in Egypt, he had this delusion that he would tell people about, that he believed that that the Nile was there just for him. He worshipped the Nile, and he believes that he created himself. So it's like this ultimate arrogance. It's like when people say, like, where did you come from? And instead of saying that they came from a higher creator, there's this like sense and really a delusion that they came from themselves, that they created themselves, which really doesn't make any sense if you think about it, right? Everything has to have an original source to it. And so now we can understand why this connection that the sages made, and this is taught in the Gemara in Masechet Sota on page 4b, and I alluded to it in the introduction, that arrogance is likened to idolatry, because we see that they're really like rooted in the same place. Because the root of idolatry, where does idolatry come from? How is it that somebody could come to the place of worshiping something other than God? It's from this space of believing that something has an existence other than God, that is separate from God. So it's not saying that God doesn't exist, right? So it's like these things, again, these klipos, these sitra achar, this other sideness stuff. They may very well acknowledge God's existence. And in fact, if they're honest, they have to, because they recognize that really, truly their existence and nourishment has to come from God. But it comes from God in this very backhanded kind of way, to such a point that they actually, while they may believe in God, they also believe in themselves. They believe that there is this other existence other than God. And so thus, for these forces, for these negative forces, how do they refer to God? So the Gemara says, and this is from Menachos, page 110a, that's in the Gemara, they refer to God as being the Eloka de Elokaya, the God of all gods. So it's like they see God as like the supreme God, but there's other forces at play also. So it's kind of like a little tangent here, but what this makes me think about is recently I was actually talking to somebody who was asking me about called me to ask for advice actually, and was asking about this idea of like, if how could it be if God is all good? The famous question, how could it be if God is all good? Why do people do bad things to other people? Why does God let this happen? Why does God let one person cheat another person, steal from another person, murder another person, that kind of stuff? And this person said that they actually asked a rabbi about this, and the rabbi, believe it or not, said to them, well, you're giving too much power to God. And really there's a God, but then there's these people that also have power. And I said to this person on the phone, I said, that is blasphemous. That is, I don't know who this rabbi is, but that is the total antithesis of everything that Torah, Judaism, especially Chassidus, especially, the Tanya stands for. We absolutely do not believe that a person, God forbid, has any power apart from God. So when a person is, and we've spoken about this in a previous episode, when a person cheats another person or steals from another person or murders another person, yes, sure, they're held accountable for the intention behind their actions, because we all do have to be held accountable for what it is that we do. But the actual power to bring that action about, to actually make the stealing happen, to make the cheating happen, whatever that is, and somehow it's orchestrated that this cheating or stealing should happen, the victim in it, like what it's happening to them, that's all orchestrated by God. So it's not only that God is like the ultimate power, but God is the sole power. God is the only power. And to not recognize that, to say God is the ultimate power, but yet we have these other powers too, that's total idolatry, is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. So now we can understand that arrogance, which truly is ascribing any power to yourself, is really a form of arrogance. This is really rooted in idolatry. Because through seeing yourself as being a yesh, as a somethingness, like something separate from God, somebody doing this actually separates themselves from the holiness of God, because they're not totally nullified to God, because holiness can only dwell on something which is totally nullified to it. So this is why the Zohar refers to the klipos as being the peaks of separation. And so now we can understand that this idea of recognizing that there's something of thinking, having a delusion that there's something that exists that's apart from God, is actually a denial of God's true unity, because the true reality is that there is nothing apart from God, and everything is nullified to God, and God is constantly vivifying and bringing into existence something for nothing, everything in the world perpetually, and there can be nothing out, and nothing else can have any kind of existence or sustainability apart from God. So that's the end of this section. And so just to kind of, bring it together, this is a really fundamental principle that is really difficult to grasp. And it's something that we kind of need to constantly work on, is it's difficult because it's like God created us in such a way that we feel ourselves to be separate entities from him. Like, it's built into Judaism. Like, we pray to God. So there is a me that prays to God, right? I wake up in the morning. I have my own thoughts. I have my own speech. I have my own, actions that I do. So while this is true, this is our perception of like this ownership over our lives that we have. It's ultimately, we're nothing except for God, because God is ultimately the source of our entire existence. So anytime we I guess a practical way that we can really apply this to is that if you, this came up in another share that I listened to recently, actually, it was an example that was given, is let's say if you run a business, like I run a business, right? So, if you are trying to get a really good client and you work really hard to get that client, and then eventually you get the client, you sign the contract, it's easy, it's natural for us to pat ourselves on the back and to say, oh, yay, I did such really good work. I got that client. I got that client because of my superior sales skills and my business skills and all of that stuff. And that's absolutely not true. You got that client because God wanted you to get that client. Sure, we want to work on ourselves. We want to refine ourselves. We want to do what's known in Hebrew as our hishtadlus. But the trick of reality is to really constantly live in this place of paradox that, well, we put in our full effort and we really do want to be the best, salespeople that we can be, the best business people we can be, the best parents we can be, the best friends we can be, all of this stuff. Like, the work of our lives is to refine ourselves. The result of those actions and who we ultimately are and who we ultimately manifest, really ultimately our whole entire existence is nothing but God. It's all dependent upon God. So if we feel a sense of arrogance, if we feel at any moment a sense of ownership over any of our accomplishments. This is a really intense idea, but really feeling a sense of ownership over our accomplishments is a form of arrogance, feeling that we are separate from God, feeling that we did this, God did not do this, this was us. That is, on a small scale, maybe not even such a small scale, a form of idolatry. It's rooted in the same place as idolatry, because idolatry isn't saying that God doesn't exist. Idolatry is saying that God exists, but there's another power. There's another power in the world also. Another topic that comes to mind for me for this is the idea of codependency. And codependency, what is codependency? Codependency, I mean, it's a huge topic, the truth is, but one aspect of codependency is having a delusion that you can control another person. So you can, like a codependent person has, on a conscious level or a subconscious level, will be the type of person who's like a people pleaser, who might bend over backwards to do things in order to get the other person to like them, to control them, to manipulate them into doing things that you want them to do. And the truth is, this is a delusion, because there's absolutely nothing that you can do to make another person like you, to make another person accept you, to make another person be nice to you. To think that you can do this, to think that you have such control over another person is very arrogant. And it's, in fact, once again, rooted, because where is arrogance rooted in idolatry. So it's an intense message, but it really is, if we tap into this message in a real way, it's kind of the secret to life. It's kind of the secret to happiness and to living our fullest lives and to be living truly in reality, because in reality, and it's very liberating too, because once you recognize that you actually don't have control over anything, and while yes, of course, we have to take responsibility for our behaviors and for our intentions behind our behaviors, that's not a contradiction to the fact that ultimately, at the end of the day, the results of our actions, the results of our thoughts, the results of other people's actions are not from them. It's all coming from God. Everything comes from God. We come from God. So that's the end of the section for today. And we will continue along these lines tomorrow when we begin a new chapter, chapter 23, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.